Truth never arrives politely. It tears through the surface of our assumptions, and Bukowski is the rip in that surface. He is the reminder that philosophy is not confined to systems, theories, or the halls of academia, but often bleeds from a life lived without sedatives or disguises. His work exposes what most people spend their entire existence avoiding: the raw mechanics of suffering, the weight of freedom, the ferocity of authenticity. Before Camus called revolt a duty, before Sartre framed freedom as a burden, Bukowski was already living these ideas as a daily confrontation with himself. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the ground. Distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Bukowski stands at the crossroads of existentialism, depth psychology, and the humanist struggle for meaning. He is not a theorist. He is a test case, a living argument, a man whose scars reveal more than polished doctrines ever could. Through him, the tensions of Kierkegaard's despair, Jung's shadow, and Heidegger's authenticity converge into something brutally alive. And this is why he matters now, in the quiet exhaustion of the early 2025 world. Modern life has not cured anguish. It has only muted it with noise. We remain restless. We remain fractured. We remain afraid of the truth that Bukowski forces us to confront, that meaning is not found, but carved out of the wreckage of one's own contradictions. This introduction opens the door. What follows moves deeper, into the body of thought where suffering becomes illumination, where freedom demands its price, and where the self is finally stripped of every mask. Suffering is never what we think it is. It is not an interruption of life, but the hidden architecture that shapes the self long before the self learns to speak. It stands beneath every gesture, every belief, every attempt to outrun the darkness. And few lives reveal this more brutally than that of Charles Bukowski, a man who did not construct a philosophy, but lived as if thrown into an experiment designed to strip the human condition down to its bones. His pages do not offer consolation. They beckon toward confrontation. They demand we stop pretending the wound is incidental. Before modern psychology named trauma, and before existentialism became an academic vocabulary, the wound had already carved itself into him. When the world still believed discipline forged strength and silence equaled character, he intuited what thinkers like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud would later articulate. A childhood blow does not stay in childhood. It mutates. It tunnels inward. It becomes the unseen axis upon which identity spins. And when the philosophers of existence began to speak of dread, of the necessity of facing the abyss, writers like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Soren Kierkegaard were merely giving language to what Bukowski had already survived by instinct. The human being becomes conscious only when pierced. Suffering as the foundation of personal philosophy demands a brutal assertion. The wound is not a curse. It is the raw material of freedom. But this truth is always resisted because it dismantles our preferred illusions. We want pain to be exceptional. We want it to be avoidable. We want it to be the enemy. Yet the wound refuses these narratives. It insists on being central. It reveals the early fracture not as a deviation in development, but as the crucible where the self first feels the pressure to become. Deep psychology exposes the mechanics of this process. A child meets violence, humiliation, insecurity before possessing the tools to interpret it. The psyche absorbs the blow and responds by creating hardened structures, defenses, projections, compensations. These layers of protection form the first architecture of the ego, but they also trap it. What appears to be personality is often a survival blueprint drafted under duress. And because the psyche learns early to equate authenticity with danger, adulthood becomes a series of evasions disguised as choices. The individual walks through life armored, yet hollow. This is why existential philosophy collides with childhood trauma so violently. It asserts that authenticity requires exposure. It demands a stripping away of defenses. It confronts the individual with a question Kierkegaard sharpened into a blade. Who are you when the roles fall away? Camus deepened the blow by insisting that clarity emerges only when we stare into the absurd without flinching. Sartre intensified the pressure by arguing that we are condemned to freedom, meaning we cannot escape responsibility for our becoming, not even by blaming the world that damaged us. And Martin Heidegger drove the point further by revealing that the self is never truly itself until it stands naked before its own facticity. Bukowski lived this confrontation without philosophical vocabulary. His childhood was not a metaphor. It was a daily assault. It produced the kind of fractured interior that forces a person either to collapse or to awaken. He did not collapse. He chose awakening, though it was an awakening soaked in alcohol, rage, solitude, and relentless observation of the human animal. His writings are the residue of a psyche refusing to numb itself into conformity. Every line testifies to this. Suffering did not make him noble. It made him truthful. To understand suffering as a philosophical foundation, we must break it into the forces that shape the inner landscape. First, suffering as exposure. It removes the illusions of safety that childhood promises. It reveals the world not as a nurturing sanctuary, but as a battlefield where meaning must be forged, not inherited. This exposure stuns the psyche, but also initiates the first form of existential awareness. The individual sees, abruptly, that life is not structured to protect them. Misunderstanding arises when we treat this awareness as pessimism. It is not. It is clarity before ideology, clarity before comfort, and clarity is the beginning of agency. Second, suffering as resistance. The wound creates a counterforce in the individual. A person who has known early pain becomes attuned to falsehood. They sense the hollowness beneath social rituals. They distrust promises. They question motives. Society misreads this as cynicism, but cynicism is defense. Resistance is awakening. The wounded mind resists not out of bitterness, but out of an intuitive recognition that most of what surrounds it is fabrication. This resistance becomes the seed of authenticity. Third, suffering as propulsion. Pain pushes. It demands movement. It generates an inner restlessness that refuses stagnation. This is why many of the most penetrating thinkers emerged from broken histories. They were not trying to build theories. They were trying to breathe. The desire to understand becomes a survival instinct. Misinterpretation arises when we romanticize this force as artistic temperament. It is far more primal than that. It is the psyche fighting to turn chaos into coherence. In the modern world of 2025, suffering has not vanished. It has merely been disguised. Technology offers distraction, not salvation. Therapy offers vocabulary, not transformation. Society encourages us to soothe, not to confront. We have become experts in numbing the wound, but amateurs in listening to it. We medicate quicker. We rationalize faster. We avoid more skillfully. But avoidance does not erase the wound. It only buries it deeper until the psyche fractures under the weight of its own avoidance. Modern individuals suffer differently, but not less. Their wounds are quiet, dispersed, internalized. They do not erupt through visible violence, but through chronic exhaustion, anxiety, emotional distance, and an unshakable sense of inadequacy. They are haunted not by physical blows, but by the relentless feeling of not being enough. Yet the psychological mechanism is the same as in Bukowski's childhood. The wound shapes the self, whether acknowledged or denied. This is why existential psychology remains relevant. It forces the confrontation we try to escape. It states plainly that suffering is not an accidental guest in the house of being. It is the foundation stone. It presses us to name what we fear naming. It asks why we cling to narratives that suffocate us. It demands we recognize that our avoidance is a form of quiet self-betrayal. And it places responsibility back where it belongs, within the individual who must choose truth over sedation. The roots of suffering grow in the silent chambers of the psyche. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of exposure, fear of failure, fear of being unlovable. These fears become the unseen compass directing every decision. They distort relationships. They dictate ambitions. They shape moral choices. They hide in our laughter and in our indifference. They whisper that safety lies in pretending. But pretending is suffocation in slow motion. The self rots behind the mask long before the world notices. Bukowski becomes a symbolic figure here, not because his life was extraordinary, but because it was unvarnished. He did not negotiate with his suffering. He let it speak. He did not sanitize it. He translated it. He did not excuse it. He confronted it. Through him, we witness the raw mechanism by which pain becomes perception. His life illustrates that the wound, when faced without denial, becomes a teacher more ruthless and more honest than any philosophical doctrine. He stands as a reminder that suffering is not a detour, but a doorway into self-knowledge, into freedom, into authenticity, into the fierce clarity that arises when a person stops running and begins listening. What he endured became the lens through which he saw the world, stripped of illusions, stripped of pretenses, stripped of the comforting narratives that society uses to drown out existential dread. Truth born from suffering carries a weight that comfort cannot mimic. It cuts through distraction. It confronts the individual with their own contradictions. It demands the restructuring of one's internal architecture. And once this restructuring begins, the self cannot return to its previous state. The wound becomes not an obstacle, but an initiation. All of this converges upon a single insight. Suffering is not the enemy of meaning. It is the soil from which meaning grows. It forces us to descend into the depths we spend our lives avoiding. It reveals the cost of existence. It strips us of illusions until only the essential remains. And in that stripped space, something fierce awakens. And it is from that awakening that the next question rises. The question that pulls inevitably into the territory where pain transforms into a different form of truth, demanding a new kind of confrontation, a new kind of honesty, a new kind of courage. Authenticity is never a lifestyle choice. It is a demand that strips the individual of every false layer until only the unmediated core remains. And nothing exposes this demand more violently than the stark instruction engraved on Bukowski's gravestone: don't try. These two words look like resignation, but they are a command. They refuse pretense. They confront the self with the truth that effort, when driven by ego, corruption, or fear, is a form of betrayal. What collapses here is the myth that striving equals meaning. What rises is a philosophy born not from theory, but from blood and bone. Long before the modern world began worshipping productivity and fabricating identities for public consumption, thinkers like Martin Heidegger sensed the sickness in human striving. He warned that most attempts at self-definition are merely attempts to escape the anxiety of being. Kierkegaard sharpened the wound by arguing that the crowd seduces the individual into forgetting themselves. And Camus, staring at the absurd, insisted that authentic action emerges only when a person ceases to negotiate with illusion. Bukowski arrived at the same conclusion without attending a single philosophical lecture. His life distilled these truths into the brutal clarity of don't try, not as laziness, but as existential rebellion. To understand this, the first illusion must be stripped away. Don't try does not mean don't act. It means reject the counterfeit motives that deform action. It means refuse the compulsive need to impress, to conform, to validate one's existence through applause. It means stop performing a version of yourself crafted for an audience you do not respect. Society misreads the command because society is built on performance. Bukowski's refusal unsettles people because it exposes how much of their effort is driven not by desire, but by fear. To decode this philosophy, it must be divided into its internal mechanisms. First, authenticity as an ontological stance. Heidegger warned that humans drift into the they self, a diluted identity shaped by expectation. In this drift, a person acts not from essence, but from imitation. Don't try is a revolt against this drift. It demands a return to the origin, a grounding in the self that precedes social contamination. This is why Bukowski's writing feels abrasive. It lacks the smoothing influence of conformity. It speaks from the raw place beneath the persona. Misinterpretation arises when people confuse rawness with carelessness. But rawness is precision without disguise. It is the refusal to dilute truth for comfort. Second, non-striving as liberation from social corruption. In the modern world of 2025, striving has become a form of slavery. People strive to appear successful, not to become themselves. They strive to please algorithms, institutions, employers, audiences, even imaginary observers who exist only in their minds. This striving is not growth, it is erosion. Don't try disarms this mechanism. It commands the individual to remove the strings by refusing to dance for approval. The misunderstanding lies in assuming this yields passivity. In reality, it produces the fiercest form of agency, a self that cannot be manipulated. Third, natural action as the deepest form of truth. For Bukowski, real work emerges when the ego stops forcing. It is the moment when writing writes itself, when living becomes a flow instead of a calculation. Kierkegaard described this as inwardness. Camus described it as lucidity. Bukowski lived it by subtraction, by peeling away everything artificial until only instinct remained. This instinct is not primitive. It is uncorrupted. It produces work that resonates because it is not designed to resonate. It simply exists, unapologetically, like a rock in the desert refusing to explain itself. Modern individuals struggle with authenticity because they have replaced being with branding. They curate versions of themselves the way corporations curate products. The result is exhaustion so widespread it has become invisible. People try incessantly. They try to be good. They try to be successful. They try to be liked. They try to be impressive. They try to be relevant. And beneath this trying, something essential dies. They live at a distance from their own desires. They forget the shape of their own voice. They become experts in adaptation and amateurs in existence. Don't try is a knife that cuts this distance. It asks the modern self a question most avoid. Who are you without the effort to seem? The confrontation is brutal because the answer is rarely flattering. It exposes the gap between the self you perform and the self you inhabit. It forces a reckoning with the possibility that much of your life has been constructed around avoidance. But without this reckoning, authenticity remains impossible. Existential psychology reveals the root of the struggle. Humans try not because they desire truth, but because they fear inadequacy. The striving is camouflage. It hides insecurity behind achievement. It masks emptiness with busyness. It paints over despair with productivity. The psyche fears stillness because stillness unearths the hollowness beneath the striving. Don't try demands stillness. It demands exposure. It demands the courage to confront what remains when the performance ends. Bukowski becomes a symbolic figure here because he did not negotiate with the terms of existence. He lived at the edges society tries to censor: the bar, the room, the solitude. the raw page unfiltered by academic polish. He worked menial jobs, drank heavily, failed often, spoke crudely, refused invitation into polite intellectual circles. And yet through this mess, he achieved what philosophers spent decades theorizing: a state where action arises from essence rather than expectation. His life illustrates that authenticity is not elegance, it is ferocity. It is the willingness to dismantle every lie about who you are supposed to be. People often point to his tombstone as a paradox. How could a man who wrote thousands of pages, published countless poems, endured decades of rejection, and finally became famous, say, "Don't try"? But the paradox dissolves once the philosophy is understood. His work did not emerge from ambition. It emerged from compulsion, from necessity, from the internal pressure that forces truth onto the page. He did not try to write. He wrote because not writing would have been a deeper betrayal. The trying that he condemned is the trying that bends the self toward external reward. Authentic action has no audience. It is not a performance. It is not a negotiation. It is a declaration of being. And in a culture that asks individuals to constantly optimize themselves, authenticity becomes a form of rebellion, not through aggression, but through refusal. Refusal to pretend, refusal to seek permission, refusal to obey the invisible rules that shrink the soul into a marketable shape. The modern condition reveals how far we have drifted from this. People curate their digital selves like monuments to fabricated narratives. They live in the shadow of expectations they did not choose. They measure their worth in metrics that have nothing to do with truth. And as they try to maintain these constructs, they fracture internally. Their lives become an unending attempt to hold together images that were never real. Bukowski's command detonates these structures. Don't try says, let it collapse. There is a psychological violence in this command because it strips away the illusions that many depend on for stability, but stability built on. Falsehood is a slow form of suffocation. The psyche senses the deception. It resists through symptoms: anxiety, despair, numbness, resentment, chronic fatigue. These are not personal failures. They are the soul pulling against the chains of inauthentic living. Don't try gives language to this rebellion. It affirms the body's refusal to endure falseness any longer. Yet the philosophy demands more than simply stopping. It demands the rediscovery of the natural self beneath the ruins. That self is often fragile, unpolished, unfinished, but it is real. It does not negotiate. It does not perform. It does not try to be admirable. It simply exists, stripped of ornament. And from this stripped state, genuine creativity, genuine connection, genuine purpose can finally emerge. Bukowski demonstrates this through his existence rather than his ideas. His authenticity was not an achievement. It was a consequence of refusing to alter himself for acceptance. He lived with the raw edges exposed. He accepted his contradictions instead of hiding them. He embraced the mess of his humanity without apology. And in doing so, He revealed a path that modern individuals, drowning in curated identities, desperately need to relearn. Don't try becomes not a nihilistic surrender, but a spiritual inversion. It turns the gaze inward. It demands that action arise from being rather than fear. It asks the individual to step out of the machinery of societal expectation and reclaim the terrain of the self. This reclamation is not gentle. It is a tearing down. But in the tearing, truth appears. And once this truth appears, the individual must face the next question, the one that waits inevitably beyond authenticity, the question that exposes how the world attempts to crush this reclaimed self through the relentless machinery of labor, repetition, and meaninglessness, a machinery that Bukowski knew too well. The machinery of modern life does not break us with a single blow. It grinds us down through repetition, so numbing that the soul forgets it was ever meant to move freely. And nothing reveals this more starkly than Bukowski's years inside the postal system, a lived demonstration of how labor, when stripped of meaning, becomes a slow annihilation of the self. The previous reckoning with authenticity inevitably collides with this truth. Once a person discovers who they are, the world immediately demands they trade that discovery for survival. Here begins the deep fracture between being and functioning. Long before corporate culture turned workers into data points and performance metrics, Marx already warned that labor could sever a person from their essence. Alienation was not metaphor, but mechanism. When the worker becomes an appendage of the machine, the inner life withers. Camus, decades later, would illuminate the same truth through the figure of Sisyphus, the human condemned to repeat the same action endlessly confronts the absurd head-on. Bukowski lived this. Convergence without theory. His job was not a symbol. It was a daily confrontation with the slow death that occurs when time is exchanged for nothingness. To understand the violence of this condition, the first truth must be exposed. Meaningless labor does not simply exhaust the body, it corrodes identity. The individual begins to experience themselves as a tool rather than a being. The hours become interchangeable, the days flatten, the self dissolves into routine. What Marx named alienation is not an abstract philosophical state. It is the moment the worker feels detached from what they do, who they are, and what they desire. Bukowski's years in the postal system were not only tedious, they were a lived disintegration. His soul existed elsewhere while his body sorted mail, delivered envelopes, and inhabited a job that demanded obedience rather than thought. Camus deepens this understanding by revealing the existential dimension of repetition. Sisyphus is not merely a myth, he is the modern worker. He pushes the stone not because he chooses to, but because the universe has placed him in a loop that mocks his awareness. Bukowski's stone was the sack of letters, the endless conveyor belts, the shifting schedules designed to erase the distinction between days. But unlike Sisyphus, he had language, and through language he exposed the absurdity that millions endure in silence. Erich Fromm completes the triad. He warned that modern industrial societies turn humans into instruments of production, valued not for inner life, but for output. The danger is not exploitation alone, it is dehumanization. When a person becomes a function, they lose the ability to experience themselves as a subject. Bukowski felt this acutely. His survival required a surrender of time so complete that it threatened to erase the very source of his authenticity. The workplace became a training ground in numbness. In the world of 2025, this machinery has only become more polished. Jobs no longer break the body, they flatten the mind. Digital systems monitor productivity with cold precision. Workers become avatars of efficiency. The boundaries between personal life and labor dissolve into constant availability. The modern individual, empowered by technology, finds themselves paradoxically more trapped than ever. They check emails at midnight. They measure their worth in metrics. They lose themselves in tasks that provide no nourishment. The alienation Marx foresaw has expanded into a global condition. But the deeper violence is not external. It is internal. The psyche adapts. It accepts the machinery as natural. It begins to equate identity with function. People say, "I am busy," as if it were proof of existence. They cling to schedules because the silence beyond them feels unbearable. They tolerate meaninglessness because meaning would require revolt. The worker becomes their own oppressor, enforcing routines that slowly bury the self they once tried to reclaim. Bukowski resisted this internal collapse, not through righteousness, but through refusal. He did not romanticize labor. He did not worship the dignity of work. He saw the machine for what it was, a structure designed to consume human time in exchange for survival. He lived the psychic suffocation that occurs when existence becomes an equation of hours for wages. And because he did not numb himself into compliance, he became a witness to a truth many spend their lives avoiding. Labor without meaning is a form of spiritual starvation. This starvation manifests in the modern worker through symptoms society misreads: chronic exhaustion, anxiety, emotional detachment, silent resentment, an unnameable longing for something that feels out of reach. People believe they are tired because they do too much. In reality, they are tired because they do too little that belongs to them. Their effort is captured by systems that do not care for their becoming. Their attention is consumed by tasks that do not align with their essence. Their energy is drained by structures that reduce them to replaceable parts. Bukowski's existence inside the postal machine becomes symbolic because he saw what others refused to see. The machine was not an employer. It was an existential opponent. It demanded conformity of rhythm, thought, and emotion. It trained him to endure repetition without rebellion. But instead of absorbing the lesson, he transformed the machinery into fuel for awakening. Every shift became evidence of how not to live. Every morning became an indictment of what society expects from a human being. This transformation is not romantic. It is violent. It requires admitting that meaning cannot be found in systems designed for efficiency, not humanity. It forces the individual to confront the truth that no job, however stable, can substitute for purpose. It demands recognition that survival, if disconnected from essence, becomes a slow betrayal. Bukowski recognized this not as philosophy, but as bodily truth. His stomach reacted, his nerves reacted, his spirit reacted. The body refuses to thrive in captivity. Modern individuals attempt to cope through productivity culture, believing that if they optimize themselves, the meaninglessness will disappear. But optimization is simply a more sophisticated form of surrender. It teaches the individual to adapt to the machinery instead of questioning it. It rewards those who sacrifice their inner lives for external metrics. It glorifies exhaustion as dedication. And beneath this false glow lies the same emptiness Bukowski felt sorting mail in the dead hours of the night. But here is the crucial existential revelation. The machinery is not only outside, it is inside. The worker internalizes the rhythms of alienation. They carry the repetition into their relationships, their thoughts, their dreams. They begin to think in loops. They lose the capacity for stillness. They fear unstructured time because it reveals the hollowness created by the machinery. To escape external alienation, they must break the internal machinery first. Bukowski did this not by quitting immediately, but by refusing to let the job define him. He wrote in the cracks of exhaustion. He preserved a corner of himself untouched by the machine. He allowed rage, despair, humor, and bitterness to become instruments of clarity. Through this clarity, he prepared himself to walk away before the machinery consumed him entirely. His exit was not an act of courage, but an act of necessity. The self, if ignored long enough, prepares its own rebellion. What makes his story philosophically potent is that he embodies the worker who refuses to become an object. He illustrates the cost of maintaining a self in a world that prefers instruments over individuals. He reveals the internal fracture between the life one must endure and the life one must protect. And he demonstrates that revolt begins not with action, but with perception. To see the machinery clearly is already to loosen its grip. Once this clarity emerges, the individual confronts a new terrain, one that is neither labor nor rebellion, but a deeper solitude where the self must rebuild itself from the ruins of alienation. A solitude Bukowski entered not by choice, but by necessity, the kind that prepares the ground for the next truth waiting in the quiet. Solitude is never the absence of others. It is the presence of the self in its most unguarded state. And once the machinery of modern labor has stripped a person of rhythm, meaning, and inwardness, solitude becomes not a luxury, but a necessity, the only environment where the fractured pieces of the self can begin to reassemble. Bukowski entered this terrain not as a seeker of enlightenment, but as a man pushed to the edge of himself. Yet it is precisely at this edge that philosophy becomes unavoidable. When the world exhausts you, you are forced into the only space it cannot occupy, your own interior, the solitude Bukowski inhabited was not romantic. It was not the gentle silence of retreats or the curated stillness sold in wellness culture. It was harsh, unfiltered, and often brutal, the kind of solitude that burns away pretense. Before psychological theories framed aloneness as introspective practice, and before spiritual traditions glamorized it as awakening, the truth had already been lived by those who had no choice but to face themselves without distraction. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote of becoming who you are. Kierkegaard sensed it when he warned that the crowd is untruth. And Bukowski, in his raw, unvarnished way, lived it without footnotes. To grasp the philosophical gravity of solitude, the first illusion must be stripped away. Solitude is not isolation. Isolation closes, solitude opens. Isolation contracts the psyche into fear. Solitude expands it into confrontation. Isolation hides, solitude reveals. Society confuses the two because it fears the kind of introspection solitude demands. People avoid being alone not because they dislike silence, but because silence exposes truths they have spent years burying under noise. Solitude demands a reckoning with the self that the machinery of daily life conveniently prevents. This reckoning begins with the collapse of external identity. When a person steps away from the rhythms of work, relationships, and constant motion, the surface layers fall off. What remains is unmediated presence. This presence is unsettling because it resists distraction. It pulls the individual inward, forcing them to examine their motivations, contradictions, desires, and wounds. Psychological theories describe this as integration of the inner world. But the integration is not gentle, it is surgical. It cuts through illusions and confronts the individual with the question they have avoided. What remains when nothing is demanding your performance? Bukowski's solitude was a laboratory of this confrontation. He withdrew into small rooms with leaking sinks, bare walls, cheap bottles lined on the floor, and silence so thick it could suffocate or liberate, depending on whether he resisted or surrendered. He chose surrender. He allowed the solitude to become a mirror that reflected not who he pretended to be, but who he was, beneath exhaustion, bitterness, desire, and rage. In this confrontation, he discovered a truth the modern world avoids. Solitude is the only place where the self can be heard clearly. Modern individuals flee solitude because their inner world is cluttered with unresolved history. They use noise as armor, constant connectivity as avoidance, productivity as narcotic. The world of 2025 is engineered to eradicate solitude through infinite stimulation. Notifications replace silence. Feeds replace introspection. Conversations become performances. Minds itch for distraction the way addicts crave chemicals. But beneath this relentless noise lies a psyche that is starving for a space to be. Breathe. Solitude is that space. But entering it requires walking through discomfort that most refuse to face. The psyche, when exposed to solitude, begins revealing its layers. First comes restlessness, the mind grasping for external engagement. Then comes discomfort, the surfacing of thoughts long ignored. Then comes fear, the realization that identity has been tied to roles and noise. But if the individual persists, something shifts. The noise fades. The inner voice sharpens. A new center begins to form, not based on expectation, but on truth. This is the psychological alchemy Jung alluded to, the integration of shadow, the reclaiming of the parts of the self abandoned in pursuit of acceptance. Bukowski's solitude forced him into this alchemy. His writing emerged from the quiet that others avoid. He did not decorate his loneliness. He inhabited it. And in that habitation, he discovered what Nietzsche demanded, the courage to confront oneself without flinching. Nietzsche believed that becoming who you are requires an environment where the noise of society cannot reach. Solitude is that environment. It dismantles imitation and exposes the core of being. But solitude is not only introspection, it is liberation. Once a person becomes acquainted with the depth of their inner world, external pressure loses its authority. The opinions of others shrink. The machinery of expectation weakens. The individual no longer seeks validation from the crowd because they have tasted the clarity that emerges when the crowd disappears. This clarity becomes a shield. It becomes a compass. It becomes a refusal to let external forces dictate internal truth. Yet solitude is also dangerous because it removes the numbing effect of social distraction. It reveals emotional landscapes that have been silenced, childhood wounds, abandoned dreams, suppressed desires, existential anxiety. These elements surface not to torment, but to be integrated. Psychological healing requires exposure. Philosophical awakening requires descent. Bukowski descended willingly, not to heal, but to understand. He allowed solitude to strip away illusions until only the essential remained. The modern resistance to solitude reveals a deeper existential sickness. People fear being alone because they fear encountering themselves. They fear the emptiness created by lives built on routine rather than purpose. They fear the confrontation with meaninglessness. But this fear is misplaced. The danger is not solitude. The danger is living a life so filled with noise that the self never has a chance to speak. Solitude is not the cause of emptiness. It is the mirror that reveals it. Bukowski understood that creativity and survival were impossible without solitude. Writing was not an act of expression. It was an act of excavation. To write, he had to sit in a room long enough for the truth to appear. He had to endure the discomfort until it transformed into clarity. Solitude was not an escape from the world. It was the place where he reclaimed himself after being drained by labor, society, and human entanglement. It was a sanctuary carved from necessity, not luxury. This necessity exposes another truth. Solitude is the birthplace of authenticity. Without it, individuals become extensions of their environment. They reflect the desires of others. They mimic the ambitions of the crowd. They absorb norms without questioning them. But once solitude enters, imitation dissolves, and the individual begins to differentiate between what they want and what they were taught to want. This differentiation is the foundation of freedom. Freedom requires isolation from coercive forces. It requires distance from the noise that molds the mind. It requires time alone with the self, long enough to hear the internal compass recalibrate. Bukowski found this freedom not in transcendence, but in raw, unfiltered solitude. His authenticity was born in silence, refined in loneliness, sharpened in hours spent staring into the void that most refused to approach. And through that void, he discovered a world more honest than the one outside his door. Yet solitude, once entered fully, does not remain static. It evolves. What begins as withdrawal becomes introspection. What begins as introspection becomes clarity. What begins as clarity becomes transformation. The self, once fragmented by alienation, begins to cohere. The individual learns to inhabit their own presence without fear. They learn to trust their own voice. They learn to stand alone without collapsing. And in this standing, they discover a new strength, independence from external validation. Bukowski's life reveals that solitude is both crucible and refuge. It burns away imitation and shelters authenticity. It injures before it heals. It isolates before it empowers. But the empowerment is profound. A self no longer dictated by the machinery of society, but anchored in its own truth. This anchoring prepares the individual for the next collision, the one that emerges not from the world of labor or solitude, but from the arena where vulnerability becomes unavoidable, where the inner wounds open once more under the weight of human connection, and where the self must confront a different kind of exposure, one that Bukowski approached with the same raw honesty as everything else he allowed himself to feel. Love does not arrive gently. It tears through the protective layers the self has built in solitude and exposes the softest parts of our being. If solitude is the crucible in which authenticity is forged, then love is the force that tests whether that authenticity can survive contact with another human soul. And for Bukowski, love was never the polished ideal the world worships. It was chaos, hunger, collision. It was a battlefield where the wounds of childhood, the scars of labor, the exhaustion of existence, and the fragile desire for connection all erupted at once. Love, for him, was the most honest form of exposure, because nothing else reveals a person so completely. The world teaches us to speak of love with tenderness, but Bukowski dismantles that illusion. He shows that love is where the psyche stops pretending. When the self meets another self, all the defenses built in childhood fracture. Freud warned that desire carries both longing and violence. Fromm insisted that love is not sentiment, but action, effort, discipline, the courage to give without guarantee. And the existentialists understood that love forces the individual to confront their freedom and responsibility. Bukowski lived all of this instinctively. His relationships were storms, but storms reveal the landscape more truthfully than calm. The core truth he exposes is stark. Love does not heal the wound, it exposes it. People enter relationships believing connection will soothe loneliness. But in reality, love makes loneliness visible. It magnifies insecurity. It surfaces every unresolved fracture. The psyche instinctively resists this exposure, but the exposure is the point. Existential psychology shows that intimacy is not possible without vulnerability, and vulnerability is not possible without risk. Love demands the surrender of control, and nothing terrifies the human psyche more than being seen without armor. Bukowski's view of love is brutal because he refuses to sanitize this process. He writes of drunken fights, shattered trust, tenderness so raw it feels like an open nerve, mornings filled with regret, yet followed by nights of reckless devotion. These contradictions are not flaws. They are the texture of real human connection. Love is not designed to be symmetrical. It is designed to confront two psyches with their own histories. His partners were mirrors, reflecting the parts of himself he tried hardest to bury. And through those mirrors, he witnessed the collision of desire and fear that defines intimacy. To understand why love reveals so much, we must examine the psychological mechanics. First comes projection. Freud identified that people fall in love not with the other, but with the image of what they lack or fear. Bukowski projected his longing for acceptance and his terror of abandonment in equal measure. This duality made his relationships volatile. He wanted closeness, but feared being consumed. He sought affection, but distrusted its sincerity. This is the paradox of wounded souls. They crave intimacy, but resist it because they expect hurt. Second comes repetition. The psyche reenacts childhood wounds, seeking resolution through others. Bukowski's chaotic relationships echoed the instability of his upbringing. Instead of healing, he repeated the pattern of pain because repetition feels familiar. This is not dysfunction, it is the psyche's attempt to rewrite the past. But rewriting requires consciousness, and before consciousness emerges, chaos takes over. Third comes exposure. When someone loves us, they see the parts we hide from the world. They see fear behind anger, longing behind indifference, fragility behind bravado. Bukowski's rough exterior did not protect him in love, it dissolved, and in that dissolution, he confronted the truth that love demands more courage than solitude. It demands the courage to let another person hold the parts of yourself that you barely hold together. In the modern world of 2025, love has become commodified. People curate themselves for algorithms. They swipe through possibilities like consumers browsing products. They confuse attraction with compatibility, conversation with connection, and attention with intimacy. But beneath this digital choreography lies the same existential hunger, the desire to be seen and the terror of being seen too deeply. Technology accelerates contact but erodes vulnerability. It offers the illusion of connection without the risk. Bukowski's world lacked these distractions, forcing him into the raw, unmediated brutality of human closeness. This brutality, however, is not cynical. It is clarifying. Love reveals the full architecture of the self, the wounds, the fears, the desires, the contradictions. And through this revelation, transformation becomes possible. Fromm insisted that love is an art requiring discipline and responsibility. But discipline is impossible without self-awareness, and self-awareness is impossible without exposure. Bukowski's relationships, though chaotic, produced immense clarity. They stripped him of illusions about romance. They forced him to confront his assumptions about worth, control, affection, and abandonment. They revealed what he could offer and what he could not bear. But love is not only mirror, it is salvation. Even in the darkest moments of his relationships, there were glimpses of transcendence, a shared laugh that dissolves bitterness, a night where two damaged souls breathe in sync, a moment of physical closeness that quiets the relentless noise of existence. These small salvations matter. They are glimpses of grace. They show that love, even when broken, can anchor a person to life. Bukowski's lovers were chaotic, but they were also lifelines. They reminded him that connection, however temporary, is a resistance to existential despair. Yet salvation carries risk. Love makes the individual dependent, not in a possessive sense, but in an existential sense. To care is to risk loss. To open is to risk abandonment. To trust is to risk betrayal. The existentialists knew that love amplifies freedom and anxiety simultaneously. It demands responsibility for another soul's vulnerability. It exposes the interdependence humans try so hard to deny. Bukowski's resistance to conventional romance was not fear of commitment. It was fear of the annihilation that comes with losing what you allow yourself to need. Still, he needed. His poetry reveals a desire for tenderness so fierce it frightens him. His stories show a longing for softness that contradicts his hardened exterior. This contradiction is not hypocrisy, it is humanity. The wounded always long for what they fear, and what they fear is always what they need most. Love is the terrain where this contradiction plays out in full. For modern individuals, this contradiction has intensified. People crave connection but guard themselves with cynicism. They desire intimacy but negotiate distance through screens. They fear abandonment but sabotage closeness to maintain control. This tension is not pathological, it is existential. It arises from the fracture between the longing for union and the reality of individuality. Love demands the navigation of this fracture, and the navigation is never clean. Bukowski's relationships show that love is a force that destabilizes but also reveals. It breaks routines, disrupts solitude, uncovers hidden fears, and challenges identity. It is not a balm, it is a crucible. And in this crucible, a different kind of self emerges, less armored, more aware, more capable of genuine connection. Even when his relationships failed, they left behind fragments of truth. These fragments shaped his understanding of human nature more profoundly than philosophy ever could. But love, once it exposes the deepest vulnerabilities, inevitably forces the individual to confront another truth. The world does not care about your tenderness. Society rewards masks, not rawness. And the moment love strips away your armor, the harshness of the external world becomes more visible than ever. Bukowski learned this through painful experience. Love revealed his softness, but it also revealed how fragile that softness was in a world that demands hardness. This fragility prepares the ground for the next existential confrontation, the one that does not arrive from the heart, but from the persona the world forces upon us, the mask we are pressured to wear once we step back into the public sphere, away from the trembling intimacy of being truly seen. Fame does not elevate the self, it distorts it. And once love has exposed the trembling interior of a human being, the world arrives with its own demand. Wear a mask, play the role, perform the version of yourself that others can consume. Bukowski confronted this invasion with the same raw honesty that shaped his solitude, labor, and relationships. Success did not liberate him. It threatened to bury him beneath a persona the world preferred. The man who wrote from the underground was suddenly pulled into the light, and the light was not illumination. It was interrogation. Before psychology gave language to the concept of persona, and long before social media industrialized self-curation, Jung already recognized the mask as a psychic necessity. Society cannot tolerate unfiltered individuality. It demands a face that aligns with expectation. The persona emerges as protection, but protection comes with a price. The self begins to suffocate beneath the very mask meant to shield it. Bukowski felt this suffocation acutely when the crowd started calling his name and the literary world turned him into a spectacle. He realized that success is simply another form of captivity, polished but no less constricting. The first illusion that must be stripped away is the belief that fame equals freedom. Freedom requires interior sovereignty. Fame replaces sovereignty with obligation. Once the public shapes its idea of who you are, deviation feels like betrayal. People wanted Bukowski, the outlaw poet, the drunk, the rough-mouthed prophet of the underclass. They did not want the complexity. They did not want the softness revealed in his private letters. They did not want the contradictions that made him human. They wanted the mask. And a mask, once demanded, becomes difficult to remove. This tension is existential. Sartre warned that being for others distorts authenticity. Heidegger insisted that publicness dissolves individuality into anonymity. Both understood that attention is a force that can deform the self. Bukowski lived this deformation in real time. As fame grew, he sensed a quiet erosion. People laughed at lines he wrote in anguish. They celebrated poems that emerged from despair. They applauded the persona while ignoring the person. This dissonance created a psychic fracture that no amount of success could repair. Modern psychology reinforces this truth. External validation strengthens the ego, but weakens the self. The ego hungers for applause, recognition, praise. The self hungers for truth. These hungers cannot coexist. When one is fed, the other starves. Bukowski fed the self through writing and the ego through fame, but the ego's appetite is infinite. The more he was celebrated, the more he felt the pressure to produce the version of himself that people admired. This pressure is invisible but crushing. It turns creation into performance and authenticity into commodity. In the world of 2025, the mask has become a global phenomenon. People build social personas more carefully than they build relationships. They curate images, polish identities, manufacture impressions. They optimize themselves for public consumption. And in this optimization, they lose the ability to distinguish between who they are and who they appear to be. Bukowski faced this struggle before it became cultural epidemic. He saw that fame is simply a concentrated form of the same distortion everyone experiences on a smaller scale. The mask functions through three mechanisms. First, distortion. It amplifies certain traits while erasing others. People wanted Bukowski's cynicism, but not his vulnerability. They wanted his anger, but not his sensitivity. Second, expectation. The audience begins to dictate the behavior of the individual. If he acted differently from the persona they had constructed, they felt betrayed, as if he owed them consistency. Third, alienation. The individual becomes a stranger to themselves, watching their own performance from the outside. The psyche splits between the performed identity and the authentic core. Bukowski recognized this split. He resented interviews, rejected literary circles, avoided intellectual posturing, not because he feared scrutiny, but because scrutiny demanded performance. The persona others projected onto him was loud, abrasive, almost mythic. The man was quieter, more observant, often wounded. The mask is always louder than the self. It dominates perception. It trains the world to listen only to the version of you that fits their narrative. But the deeper tragedy is this. If the world demands a mask long enough, the individual begins to confuse the mask for the self. Bukowski fought this confusion relentlessly. He wrote to preserve the interior world that fame threatened to overwrite. Writing became a refuge from distortion. Through the page, he could re-enter himself. He could speak without performance. He could dismantle the persona in private, even while the public fed it relentlessly. Writing was not a craft, it was self-preservation. This is where the existential tension sharpens. The self longs to remain authentic. The world demands coherence. The persona becomes a compromise between truth and expectation, and compromises of identity always cost more than they promise. The cost is internal fragmentation. The individual begins to live between two worlds, the world of appearance and the world of being. How to go on that dwelling in the they self leads to existential drift. Bukowski refused to drift. He fought to live in the world of being, even as success tried to pull him into the world of appearance. Yet fame is seductive. It offers the illusion of immortality, relevance, significance. It strokes the ego in ways the psyche finds intoxicating. Bukowski knew this temptation. He enjoyed the comfort fame afforded. He enjoyed the recognition after years of obscurity. But he also sensed the danger. The moment the self becomes dependent on the audience, freedom evaporates. And freedom was the axis of his entire existence. He would not trade it for applause. Modern individuals face this same temptation. In an era where visibility is equated with worth, people become performers in their own lives. They compete for attention, polish their mask, measure themselves through external metrics. They live in fear of irrelevance. They internalize the gaze of others. The persona becomes not a choice, but a survival strategy. But survival built on performance is not living. It is mimicry. And mimicry over time erodes the interior foundation of the self. Bukowski's life illustrates a rare resistance. He refused to let the persona colonize him. He rejected literary elitism because it demanded a mask of sophistication. He rejected mainstream culture because it demanded a mask of politeness. He even rejected fans when their adoration felt like ownership. His defiance was not arrogance, it was self-protection. He sensed that the mask, once embraced, would devour him. But resisting the mask comes with its own loneliness. When a person chooses truth over performance, they lose the comfort of belonging. The public admires authenticity from afar, but resents it up close. They want the illusion, not the interruption. Bukowski interrupted. He refused to play. And in that refusal, he paid the existential price of true individuality. Isolation from systems built on conformity. Yet within that isolation emerges a sharper truth. The self, once freed from the mask, begins to see the world with ruthless clarity. Success no longer dazzles. Praise no longer seduces. Expectations no longer bind. The individual becomes capable of confronting the most avoided truth of all, that beneath the persona lies the shadow of mortality, the one force that dismantles the mask with absolute authority. And it is toward that force that Bukowski moved next, not out of fascination, but because nothing reveals the meaning of life more starkly than the presence of death lingering at the edges of every moment. Death is not the end of life. It is the revelation of it. And once the mask of fame begins to crack under its own artificial weight, The human being is forced to confront the one truth no applause can soften and no persona can survive. Bukowski carried death with him long before it approached his body. He sensed it in the rooms he inhabited, in the nights he drank through, in the bodies he loved and lost, in the mornings that felt like borrowed time. Death for him was not an abstraction. It was a presence, a pressure, a demand. Heidegger understood this presence when he wrote that being toward death is the axis upon which authenticity turns, not because death is tragic, but because it strips life of its illusions. The individual, when forced to acknowledge mortality, is confronted with the stark truth of existence. Everything unnecessary collapses. Everything false burns away. Everything accidental falls silent. What remains is the raw weight of the self, the truth of one's choices, the clarity of one's freedom. Death reveals this clarity with ruthless generosity. Bukowski did not analyze this philosophically. He lived it viscerally. He watched friends die young. He witnessed his father's cruelty age into irrelevance. He understood that life is fragile in ways the healthy pretend not to know. Illness followed him like a quiet shadow. Violence found him early. Poverty scraped him thin. Addiction gnawed at him for decades. Every chapter of his life carried the scent of impermanence. And rather than deny this scent, he breathed it in until it sharpened his perception of everything else. The first truth death revealed to him was the triviality of social expectations. When a person recognizes that time is finite, the demand to conform loses all authority. Why perform for those who will vanish? Why obey structures that crumble? Why pretend to be what the world expects when the world itself is temporary? This recognition fueled the ferocity of his authenticity. Death was not a threat, it was a compass. It pointed him toward the essential. The second revelation is more brutal. Death exposes meaning not through comfort, but through urgency. Camus argued that confronting the absurdity of death allows individuals to reclaim their freedom. Bukowski embodied this claim. He did not romanticize death, but he allowed it to frame his choices. Every poem, every night spent writing, every refusal to comply was an act of defiance against oblivion. He knew that nothing he built would survive unchanged, but he insisted on building anyway, not for posterity, but for truth in the moment. The third revelation is psychological. Death forces the individual to confront their own interior emptiness. Beneath achievement, beneath relationships, beneath identity lies a silence that terrifies. Most people drown this silence in noise, work, routine, distraction. But death amplifies it until escape becomes impossible. Bukowski met this silence in the long nights of his life. Alone at the typewriter, he felt the weight of finitude pressing against his ribs. Instead of fleeing, he wrote through it. Writing became his way of conversing with the void. Each line was a negotiation with impermanence. In the modern world of 2025, death is hidden behind euphemisms, softened by screens, sterilized by technology. People fear aging not because of physical decline, but because it forces them to face the truth they spend every day avoiding. they will not outrun mortality. Loneliness, anxiety, burnout, and obsession with productivity all arise from this refusal. When death is denied, life becomes frantic. When death is acknowledged, life becomes clear. This clarity is not sentimental. It is confrontational. It demands that the individual examine what they devote their limited time to. Bukowski rejected obligations that felt meaningless because death made the cost too obvious. Why waste hours in rooms that suffocate? Why chase approval from people who will forget your name? Why obey rituals designed to preserve comfort rather than truth? Awareness of death dismantles the machinery of conformity more effectively than any philosophy. And yet, death does more than clarify. It humanizes. It reveals fragility beneath the hardened exterior. Bukowski, who built his persona around roughness, often wrote with startling tenderness when confronting mortality. He understood how easily a life can unravel, how quickly a person disappears, how quietly a body fails. This tenderness did not contradict his harshness. It completed it. Only those who have truly felt the nearness of death can appreciate the small gentlenesses that life offers. Death also deepens gratitude, though not in the sentimental way preached by self-help narratives. It sharpens attention. It heightens awareness of ordinary beauty. A woman's laugh in a dim bar, the silence before dawn, the weight of a warm body beside you, the soft hum of existence that continues. Despite everything, Bukowski found holiness in these fleeting moments because he understood they might vanish at any second. Death teaches appreciation not through joy, but through urgency. But perhaps the most significant revelation is this: death strips the individual of excuses. It demands accountability for one's life. No more postponing, no more pretending, no more waiting for the right moment. The right moment is the moment before the last one. Sartre claimed we are condemned to freedom, but death shows we are also condemned to responsibility. Every choice becomes irrevocable when measured against mortality. Bukowski embraced this responsibility by refusing to betray his essence. Even when it cost him stability, relationships, or reputation, he lived in accordance with the truth he recognized. And yet, despite his comfort with mortality, death still haunted him, not as fear, but as inevitability. He did not want immortality. He wanted intensity. He wanted to experience life without the dulling effect of denial. Death's presence kept him awake. It kept him honest. It kept him writing when he had nothing left but the stubborn will to say one more thing before the void took him. Modern individuals experience a fractured version of this haunting. They sense mortality but cannot articulate it. They feel it in moments of burnout, in existential fatigue, in the quiet despair that surfaces when the distractions fade. They scroll through endless images of curated lives, comparing themselves to illusions, forgetting that behind every illusion lies the same unavoidable truth: no one escapes the end. This realization should liberate, but without confrontation, it suffocates. Bukowski confronted it, and through confrontation, he found a strange kind of peace. Not comfort, not acceptance, peace. the peace of knowing that life is temporary and therefore sacred, the peace of recognizing that meaning is created, not discovered, the peace of refusing to pretend that permanence is possible. Death taught him what no philosophy could. The value of the moment lies in its fragility. But once a person understands the truth of death, another question rises with a sharper edge. If death renders everything temporary, what can possibly justify the burden of living? What force can transform pain, chaos, despair, and impermanence into something bearable, even meaningful? Bukowski found the answer not in transcendence, but in creation, in the brutal, necessary act of turning suffering into language, chaos into form, and impermanence into art. Art is never decoration. It is transformation. And once death has revealed the fragility of existence, the human being is left with a single burning question. What can be done with the unbearable weight of being aware? For Bukowski, the answer was neither salvation nor escape. It was the disciplined brutality of creation. Art was not a calling. It was not a dream. It was survival. When the void pressed against him, wrote. When loneliness constricted his chest, he wrote. When the machinery of life threatened to erase the last traces of his individuality, he wrote. Art did not beautify his suffering. It metabolized it. Before psychoanalysis identified creativity as a release of the unconscious, and long before existential thinkers framed art as rebellion against the absurd, Bukowski lived the truth instinctively. Pain is raw material. Trauma is fuel. Compulsion is the engine. Jung believed that art arises when the unconscious demands expression. Freud believed it channels forbidden desires into symbolic form. Nietzsche believed art justifies existence by transfiguring chaos into creation. Bukowski did not theorize these ideas, he enacted them. His writing was the eruption of a psyche refusing to die. To understand the role of art in his life, one must discard the romantic myth of the inspired poet. Inspiration is accidental. Necessity is relentless. Bukowski wrote because not writing would have drowned him. His pages functioned as a valve, releasing the accumulated pressure of existence. Without that release, the psyche turns inward, cannibalizes itself, spirals into despair. Creativity for him was exorcism. Each poem pulled a demon into the open. Each story dragged a memory from the shadows. Each line was a confrontation with the parts of himself he could not control. Art offered him what no philosophy, no relationship, no moment of peace ever could: a container for the unbearable. Language became architecture. Form became discipline. Chaos became rhythm. The internal storm, once shapeless, found shape. This shaping is the essence of transformation. Pain remains pain, but meaning emerges around it like a frame around a violent painting. This is what Nietzsche meant when he declared that art alone enables us to endure the truth. It does not erase the wound, it illuminates it. But illumination carries danger. To create honestly requires descending into the very depths one tries to avoid. The unconscious is not gentle territory. It holds the violence of childhood, the humiliations of adulthood, the ache of desire, the fear of annihilation. When Bukowski wrote, he opened these chambers willingly. He allowed the dark interior to pour into his work. This act is not courageous. It is sacrificial. It demands that the artist offer pieces of themselves to the page, knowing the world may consume them without understanding. Yet creation is paradoxical. It wounds and it heals. It exposes and protects. It tears the psyche open and sutures it at the same time. Bukowski often emerged from writing sessions drained, emptied, exhausted, as though he had bled through the typewriter. But he also emerged clearer, steadier, less fragmented. Art reorganized the chaos. It provided coherence, however temporary. And coherence is a rare privilege for anyone living with an unquiet mind. In the modern landscape of 2025, art has been diluted by commercialization. Suffering to echo in another's chest. This resonance is not comfort, it is recognition. To read Bukowski is to confront your own fractures reflected in his words. The connection is not gentle, but honest. And honesty is more sustaining than comfort. This is why his work endures. It speaks not to the polished parts of us, but to the wounded ones. His art bypasses intellect and strikes at the core of experience. It bypasses societal expectation and touches the raw nerve beneath it. It bypasses performance and reveals what humans look like when stripped of their masks. His harshness is clarity. His vulgarity is precision. His despair is articulation. From a psychological perspective, this articulation is crucial. Trauma that remains wordless festers. Unnamed emotions stagnate. Suppressed memories distort identity from the shadows. Art forces articulation. It demands the transformation of the unspeakable into the spoken. In this transformation, the psyche gains distance from its own pain. Not enough to escape it, but enough to endure it. Words become the thin wall between chaos and collapse. Yet for Bukowski, art was not refuge from the world. It was a confrontation with it. His writing attacked hypocrisy, mocked institutions, exposed power structures, and revealed the emptiness behind societal norms. His art was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the defense of the self against forces that sought to erase individuality. Writing was how he maintained autonomy in a world that tried relentlessly to assimilate him. But even as art empowered him, it also isolated him. The artist who reveals too much becomes difficult for society to tolerate. His honesty made him an outsider not only before fame, but after it. People admire truth in theory, not in practice. They crave authenticity as spectacle, not as challenge. Bukowski's art forced people to see parts of themselves they had abandoned, and people punish those who remind them of what they fear. Despite this, continued creating, not because he believed in legacy, but because legacy is irrelevant in the face of death. He created because the act of creation kept him alive. Each new work reaffirmed his defiance against the void. The page became the ground on which he stood when everything else felt unstable. Art gave him a structure to inhabit when the world felt uninhabitable. The deeper irony is this: through art, he became immortal in the only way that matters. Not through fame, but through resonance. Not through adoration, but through recognition. His survival instinct became a lineage of expression that outlives the body that produced it. This is the strange gift of art. It allows one person's suffering to become another person's courage. And yet the artist, once transformed by creation, must face another reality. The world he returns to after writing is still governed by power, hierarchy, and systems that twist even the purest intentions into forms of control. The artist can escape. Violence embedded within systems. He understood that institutions, no matter how noble their origins, eventually deform the very ideals they claim to protect. Power twists, power consumes, power rearranges human behavior until authenticity becomes rebellion and conformity becomes survival. Before Foucault dissected the anatomy of power, and long before Fromm exposed the psychological roots of authoritarianism, Bukowski sensed the truth in his bones. Systems do not care about individuals. They care about control. Even systems built from good intentions inevitably drift toward domination because the human beings inside them are shaped by fear, ego, and insecurity. Bukowski's mistrust of authority was not ideological. It was experiential. He lived under a father who turned order into violence. He worked under supervisors who turned hierarchy into cruelty. He witnessed institutions that transformed ordinary people into enforcers of meaningless rules. And through these experiences, recognized a brutal pattern. The structure survives by diminishing the human being. The first illusion that must be dismantled is the idea that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. They do not. Once embedded in a system, intentions mutate. A small rule becomes an instrument of coercion. A moral ideal becomes a tool for judgment. A protective measure becomes a surveillance mechanism. Bukowski saw how bureaucracy turns decency into obligation, and obligation into punishment. The more structured the environment, the less space remains for the unpredictable, the human, the vulnerable. Structure prefers predictability, but people, in their essence, are unpredictable. Therefore, systems restrict essence to maintain order. This restriction is not malicious, it is mechanical. Systems function by eliminating deviation, but eliminating deviation also eliminates individuality. Fromm warned that modern society produces individuals who escape from freedom because freedom requires responsibility. Bukowski watched people surrender their autonomy willingly, preferring obedience over risk. He despised this surrender because he sensed the existential danger within it. To abandon one's freedom is to abandon one's selfhood. Once the self is surrendered, power fills the void with its own narrative. Foucault sharpened this idea by exposing how power infiltrates the body, the psyche, the smallest gestures. Bukowski saw this long before reading any theory. In the postal office, he watched coworkers monitor each other more ruthlessly than their supervisors did. Power does not need force when it can colonize the mind. When workers begin to police one another, authority becomes invisible. An invisible power is the most dangerous kind. It shapes behavior without resistance because the individual begins to believe the behavior is natural. In the world of 2025, this internalization has deepened. People police themselves through curated identities, corporate values, digital metrics, and social expectations. Surveillance no longer feels external, it feels personal. People internalize the gaze of strangers. They discipline their own speech, desires, ambitions. They adjust their personalities to fit the invisible script of acceptability. The system no longer needs to punish deviation. Individuals punish themselves to avoid disapproval. Bukowski would have spat at this condition. He understood that a society where everyone performs for approval is a society where no one truly lives. Yet systems are not inherently evil. They become corrupt because human beings within them seek security over truth. Leaders begin with ideals. They end with control. Institutions begin with service. They end with self-preservation. Good intentions crumble beneath the weight of authority because authority demands stability above all else. Stability suppresses dissent, and dissent is the birthplace of authenticity. Bukowski's entire life was dissent. His refusal to obey, to conform, to sanitize his truth, was a rebellion not only against specific institutions, but against the underlying logic of power itself. But his rebellion was not political, it was existential. He did not fight for societal reform. He fought for the integrity of his own being. He sensed that every time he bent to a system, he lost a fragment of himself. And once enough fragments are lost, a person becomes hollow. The hollowed individual is the perfect subject of power, compliant, exhausted, directionless. Bukowski refused to become hollow. He protected his interior world with the ferocity of someone who knew that once the world enters the psyche, it will not leave voluntarily. This protection, however, came with cost. Resistance isolates. When one refuses to play the game expels them. Bukowski lived on the margins not because he was unfit for society, but because society is unfit for those who demand truth over comfort. The margins provided him the clarity to see how power distorts morality. Systems create categories of good and evil, right and wrong, allowed and forbidden. But these categories serve function, not truth. Morality becomes tool, not principle. Bukowski distrusted moral grandstanding because he sensed the machinery behind it. He knew that morality imposed from above becomes violence disguised as virtue. This insight extends into personal relationships as well. Power dynamics infiltrate intimacy. People manipulate, impose, dominate, control. Even love becomes infected by the desire to shape the other. Bukowski's chaotic relationships reflected this tension. The desire for connection collided with the instinct for autonomy. Even the people he cared about attempted to mold him into a more acceptable version of himself. But he resisted because he understood that to be loved for a mask is to be unloved entirely. Here lies the existential fracture. Human beings crave connection, but fear domination. Systems promise connection through belonging, but demand conformity in return. Bukowski saw this exchange as violence. Belonging that requires the death of individuality is another form of captivity. He chose solitude over assimilation because solitude, however painful, preserves the integrity of the self. Modern institutions amplify this tension. Corporations preach community while enforcing obedience. Governments preach safety while expanding surveillance. Social networks preach connection while extracting autonomy. People become participants in their own domination, believing they are free because they are allowed to choose among predetermined options. Freedom without authenticity is an illusion. Bukowski rejected these illusions instinctively. His rebellion was not glamorous, but it was honest. He refused to sacrifice truth for comfort, even when comfort might have eased his suffering. Yet resistance alone is insufficient. The individual must also confront the internal systems that mirror external power. The psyche builds its own hierarchies, habits that dominate behavior, fears that dictate choices, narratives that shape identity. These internal structures are as coercive as external institutions. Bukowski fought them through writing, because writing forced him to strip down the internal machinery. Each poem dissected a fear. Each story exposed a pattern. Each line confronted an illusion. Art became not only resistance to external power, but dismantling of internal power. This dismantling prepares the individual for the final confrontation. Once systems are exposed, once illusions crumble, once power is stripped of its disguises, the individual arrives face to face with the only force that cannot be resisted, negotiated with, or escaped, the force of absolute freedom. the freedom to choose, to define, to exist without excuse. A freedom that is both burden and salvation, and one that Bukowski carried with the same brutal honesty that shaped every corner of his life. Freedom is not a gift, it is a sentence. And once power has been exposed in all its subtle violence, the individual is confronted with the truth Bukowski carried like a wound and a weapon. Nothing stands between you and your life except the choices you refuse to make. Freedom demands that the self step into the open without shield or excuse. It demands responsibility for one's becoming. It demands that every act, every refusal, every surrender be owned fully. No system can be blamed. No authority can be accused. No mask can be used as alibi. This is the moment when existence becomes stark, stripped, undeniable. Sartre warned that human beings are condemned to freedom, meaning the absence of external guarantees leaves the individual alone with the burden of choice. Camus added that this burden exists within a world devoid of inherent meaning, forcing each person to construct their significance out of nothing but grit and defiance. Nietzsche, more ruthless, insisted that freedom is the privilege of those strong enough to bear the weight of their own values. Bukowski did not study these thinkers. He lived the consequences of their conclusions. Freedom shaped him long before he had language for it. The first truth freedom reveals is terrifying. No one is coming to save you. Not society, not art, not love, not the system, not even the self you idealize in your better moments. Freedom kills the fantasy of rescue. It confronts the individual with the brutal arithmetic of existence. You are responsible for what you tolerate, for what you pursue, for what you abandon, for the shape your life takes when stripped of excuses. Bukowski embraced this not out of heroism, but out of survival. He understood that if he did not seize his own life, the machinery around him would devour it. The second revelation of freedom is paradoxical. It requires solitude, but is tested in the world. Bukowski's freedom was not the abstract autonomy of philosophers. It was the lived defiance of a man refusing to be consumed by expectations. He walked out of jobs because submission felt like death. He stayed in rooms alone because the noise outside diluted his inner compass. He wrote what he wanted, even when editors begged for something more palatable. Every choice carried cost, but he accepted the cost as proof of life. Freedom, he knew, is not consequence. It is consequence. The third revelation is psychological. Freedom exposes fear. When external structures fall away, all that remains is the trembling interior that must choose without guidance. Modern individuals, overwhelmed by this burden, often flee freedom through distraction, conformity, or self-deception. They seek safety in roles, identities, institutions, ideologies. They trade autonomy for belonging, responsibility for predictability. But freedom rejected is never truly gone. It festers. It becomes quiet resentment. It becomes the unspoken ache beneath achievement. It becomes the internal whisper, "This is not your life." Bukowski heard that whisper early. It grew louder each time he surrendered a piece of himself to survive. Eventually, the whisper became a roar. Freedom was no longer a concept, it was a demand. He had to choose to stay in the postal office or to leave, to obey the machinery or to break from it, to live numb or to live raw. He chose rawness because rawness, however painful, was honest. Freedom without honesty is fantasy. Freedom with honesty is responsibility. In the world of 2025, freedom has been distorted into a marketing slogan. People speak of living authentically while outsourcing their decisions to algorithms. They speak of choosing their path while following trends engineered to capture attention. They speak of liberation while performing identities that imprison them. Modern freedom is often a curated illusion. Choices presented as empowerment, but shaped by forces the individual cannot see. Bukowski would have despised this counterfeit liberation. He believed freedom must be lived, not advertised. The essence of real freedom is choice made in full consciousness. Choice without apology. Choice without disguise. Choice that aligns with one's deepest truth, even when the cost is isolation, instability, or misunderstanding. Bukowski chose writing despite poverty. He chose solitude despite loneliness. He chose truth despite rejection. His freedom was not glamorous. It was gritty, unpolished, uncomfortable, but it was real. And reality, for him, mattered more than comfort. Yet freedom carries a darker edge. It isolates. Once a person chooses their own path, they become unintelligible to those who rely on structure to define themselves. The free individual becomes a disturbance, a reminder of possibilities others fear to confront. Bukowski lived within this disturbance. His freedom made him difficult to categorize, difficult to control, difficult to dismiss. People admired him from a distance, but recoiled from the intensity of his independence. He understood the price of being fully oneself. You walk alone more often than not. But isolation sharpened him. It forced him to rely on his inner world rather than external approval. It taught him that freedom is not the absence of influence, but the ability to resist influence that violates the self. This resistance is the foundation of personal sovereignty. Without it, the individual dissolves into the expectations of others. With it, the individual stands firm even when the world pushes back. And the world always pushes back. Systems resist the free individual. Crowds resent autonomy. Institutions demand conformity. Lovers fear being unable to contain someone who belongs only to themselves. Freedom disrupts. It creates tension. It challenges the status quo. Bukowski's life was a series of confrontations with forces that wished to tame him. But he refused taming because taming is slow death. Better the chaos of self-rule than the comfort of captivity. Freedom also demands creativity, not artistic creativity alone, but existential creativity. A person must construct meaning where none is given. They must design their life with intention. They must accept that purpose is not inherited, but built. Bukowski crafted meaning through writing, drinking, loving, failing, observing, enduring. His meaning was not noble, but it was his. And that ownership is the essence of existential freedom. But freedom is not enlightenment, it is burden. Once a person claims full responsibility for their existence, there is no turning back. They cannot blame society, upbringing, fate, or others for the choices they make. They stand alone in front of their own life. This standing is terrifying, but it is also sacred. It is the moment when the self becomes unmediated, unmasked, undeniable. Yet, even in this stark autonomy, one more layer of truth emerges. Freedom is incomplete without direction. Choosing for the sake of choosing is not liberation, but drift. Bukowski understood that freedom without purpose becomes another form of despair. He needed something to anchor his autonomy. Writing became that anchor. It gave his freedom a trajectory. It transformed raw existence into articulated meaning. Without writing, freedom would have devoured him. And this reveals the final paradox. Freedom is not the end of existential inquiry, but the beginning. Once the individual accepts full responsibility for their life, they must then decide what kind of life is worth the responsibility. They must ask what makes existence meaningful enough to endure suffering, alienation, chaos, and death. They must seek the truth that remains when illusions fall away. Bukowski sought that truth not in philosophy, religion, or ideology, but in the raw confrontation with his own humanity. And in that confrontation, he discovered a force more enduring than freedom itself: the relentless need to understand what makes a life worth living when stripped of pretense, when confronted with suffering, when illuminated by clarity, and when nothing remains but the question of meaning. Bukowski stands in the end exactly where philosophy has always pointed, but where few dare to remain: the naked intersection between pain, freedom, and meaning. His life, unruly and unschooled, becomes the very experiment that academic philosophy often avoids conducting on itself. He exposes the truth that theories are hollow unless lived, that ideas are impotent unless dragged through the mud of experience, and that the human condition reveals itself most clearly not in abstraction, but in the raw, unedited terrain of an ordinary life pushed to its limits. He shows that suffering is not an obstacle, but an initiation, that authenticity is not comfort, but rupture, that labor can break a soul long before a body, that solitude is both wound and remedy, that love tears us open so we can see ourselves, that success seduces us with the mask we eventually suffocate under, that death walks beside us, not to terrify, but to clarify, that art is the only honest alchemy the wounded possess, and that power corrodes even the best intentions until the self must reclaim its sovereignty or be erased entirely. Through him, the perennial philosophical questions lose their distance. They stop belonging to classrooms and become confrontations in the mirror. Who are you when every mask is torn away? Where does meaning hide when suffering refuses to leave? What remains when the world demands you perform? How much of your life is chosen, and how much is inherited out of fear? What, in the end, makes existence worth enduring? Bukowski never offered answers wrapped in elegance. He offered a life stripped to its bones, a testament that philosophy is not an art of speaking, but an art of surviving. And his message presses on the reader with unmistakable force. Understanding him is optional. Understanding yourself is not. Because the work of philosophy does not end with admiration. It ends when the reader is forced into their own confrontation, into their own reckoning, into their own question of what it means to live without illusion, without compromise, without retreat. It ends where excuses fall away and a life must finally face the truth of its own making.